A few years ago, when I visited India and I was returning back, I had a high school friend who became Air Force pilot. And I met him at the airport, and he asked me, "Hey, do you want to fly in the cockpit on a flight to Singapore?" And I said yes. And so his friend was flying a Singapore Airlines flight. I got to sit in the cockpit, and he just told me, "Please don't take any pictures and post it on social media, but you can enjoy being in." It was very different than when you sit in a regular plane and even by a window seat. The view you get from the cockpit is like straight on, and as the flight takes off, you get this beautiful 360-degree view of the city and the skyline and the beaches and all of that. But then, in a while, as the flight ascends, you enter the clouds, and that's when it becomes so different. We have someone training to be a pilot. He probably knows this even better. In aviation training, there is something called spatial disorientation. That is something that happens when you enter the clouds. When you are in the middle of the clouds, you really become disoriented. You don't know at that time if the airplane is ascending or descending, and if you are actually turning or going straight. And you have to totally rely on all the gears to guide you. But what happens when that's not feasible is a very catastrophic thing that we all came to hear when Kobe Bryant, who is an NBA athlete and a legend, was flying to avoid the busy LA traffic with his daughter on a helicopter, and his helicopter passed through the clouds and ended in a crash. Later on, they found out the reason that happened was exactly this. The pilot experienced spatial disorientation, and for some reason, I don't fully understand, maybe the pilot in training here can help us understand that later. He relied on his years of experience and intuition, but it ended up in a crash. His senses told him something, but the reality was different. He trusted how he felt more than what was actually true and the equipments could say. Because the investigators later on told that there was nothing wrong with the aircraft. The instruments were accurate. The problem was the pilot trusted the wrong voice. We're starting this new series called Idols of Our Heart, and we begin this series with this passage that is read to us, which contains the famous story of the golden calf, and that's the title of our sermon. And in this very opening scene, if you're reading through the book of Exodus, you see there are two contrasts that are happening. Just before this, God had given them detailed instructions of how to build his tabernacle. He even named specific people whom he said has extraordinary gifts to use their giftedness to build it. And as Moses was up on the mountain receiving the 10 commandments that God gave him face to face, and God himself wrote them on the tablet, the first of them was that they should not have any idols. Simultaneously, at the very same time, here at the foot of the hill, were the people of Israel building a new idol. It's very quick to judge them and cancel them and distance ourselves from them and feel we are better. But what they experienced back then is no different than what you and I get to experience almost every day in our lives. So today we are going to do a little anatomy of the idols of our heart. I want to talk about three things, three simple questions. How do idols form in our hearts? Second, what idols do to us? And third, how does the gospel reshape our hearts? And we'll begin with how the idols form in our hearts. There's always a pattern. We are going to get behind the story that is so familiar to us and try to extract the pattern that we see and see if that gets replicated in our hearts and in our lives as well. You know, Moses has just gone to the mountain, and in a short time, people forgot everything. A small delay in hearing from God, a small delay in seeing Moses resulted in having them move down a path of doubt, distortion, and deception. You know, those are the 3 Ds of a pathway in which an idol begins to take shape in our hearts. And I'm going to prove this to us, and you can prove this to yourself. When there is a delay in hearing God, we begin to doubt even the very nature of God. And as soon as that doubt takes form, the desire in our hearts that is not met leads us to distort the reality. And then we start listening to other voices that lead us down a deceptive pathway. A delay, a desire, and a voice lead us towards doubt, distortion, and deception. Let's unpack that. You know, first of all, the delay. Now, what is this delay? It was a brief time before Moses could come down, but what people began to think was that they thought God is absent. God was not absent. He's actually speaking to Moses, doing something special for his people. But the people interpreted that delay as, is God really at work right now? You know, God is not working. They began to doubt the character and actions and attributes of God. They began to think, is God really good at this time with this thing going on with my life? And why is not God coming through right now for us? You know, the question for us to apply is, when we experience a delay in hearing from God, or when we experience a distance from God's presence, which is one of the reasons we gather every Sunday to worship so we can experience His presence collectively as a community. But if you stop coming for a few weeks, you will see that you are going to have the same pattern. You will not be able to interpret the delays that happen in your life in an appropriate way, and you start beginning to doubt God Himself. And for us, even when you are doing this, when there is a delay, perhaps, you know, if you are in a place where you're thinking, why is my career in Silicon Valley not moving fast enough? Why am I not going where I should be? Or why is my life not where I want it to be? Whether you're thinking of being in a particular school or getting married or single or whatever it may be. And you may think, God is too slow for my timeline. And so what do we do? What do? We don't stop believing. We replace what we believe in. We replace who God really is with allowing our doubts to reshape God into a different image than who He actually is. Because there is always this desire within us, isn't it? And the desire is we want a God who can do what we want Him to do. That's what the Israelites said. He said, make us gods who shall go before us. Hey, this is how it has been. You know, we tasted extraordinary miracles from God. He did these great things back in Egypt, and He's been leading us so wonderfully. We saw God in Exodus 20. They heard the voice of God, thunder and lightning. And they want this constant spiritual highs in their lives. And if they don't have those spiritual highs, they begin to think God is not there. And if God is not constantly taking care of them and meeting their needs, then their desire becomes, I want another God. You know? What do they want in this new God? They want this new god that they created was actually the golden calf. And they wanted this golden calf because the golden calf was actually a symbol of prosperity. A calf is what people used, in cattle those days, in agriculture. And they wanted that prosperity for them because they thought that when they have the golden calf, it is going to provide them protection, it's predictable, and they feel in control. They're not wrong desires, but when good desires become ultimate demands, they become idols. A definition of idol is believing something or someone other than God can give us our heart's desire or deepest longings. Let me repeat. An idol is believing in someone or something other than God to give us our heart's desire or deepest longings. Or to condense it, an idol is anything you trust to give you what only God can give. And if God seems to not give us that, we are quick to switch. And then we start looking for other voices that can affirm our thought process. And that's where the deception comes in. You see, the delay leads to a doubt, and the doubt leads to a distortion. And now from distortion, you're looking for voices, and these voices will only lead to deception. And this is where Aaron steps in. Not doing his job as a prophet, but he just wants to please the people. And it's dangerous, isn't it? When shepherds or leaders or even heads of families, as leaders of your homes, when we fail to do what God wants us to do and compromise, it has catastrophic consequences for churches or organizations or even your own families. What we do when we face times of delay becomes the actual theology of your home. Your theology of delay is the theology that your children are going to believe. If you press the panic button when there is a delay of something happening in your life, and you start reshaping God into a different image, or actually recreating a new idol, which mostly tends to be making God in the image of your boss or your company or anybody else, that's going to stick and will have consequences. And modern day voices, we don't have Aarons walking around. When people today go through challenges or difficult times, the biggest voice that has emerged is the voice of AI. It used to be the social media influencers, but that's shifted. The Stanford University published an article just a month ago in Science magazine, and they came up with this startling conclusion about AI. They said when it comes to personal matters, AI systems might tell you what you want to hear, but perhaps not what you need to hear. They showed, the Stanford Computer Science Department, they showed that artificial intelligence large language models are overly agreeable or sycophantic when users solicit advice on interpersonal dilemmas. Even when users describe harmful or illegal behavior, the models often affirmed their choices. Myra Cheng, who is the principal investigator in this research, said by default, AI advice does not tell people that they are wrong, nor give them tough love. She's the lead author and a computer science PhD candidate, and this is what she said: I worry that people will lose the skills to deal with difficult social situations. This finding raises concerns for millions of people who are right now discussing personal conflicts with AI. And the article suggests that almost 1/3 of teenagers in the United States, 1/3, are using AI for serious conversations. They're not going to their parents to ask for input. They're not even talking to their friends or peers to ask for input. They're not coming and talking to their Sunday school teacher or youth leader or even a pastor. They're asking the AI. So you need to be aware, if your children have access to AI, what's going on. And she learned this by seeing that undergraduates in Stanford were using AI to draft breakup texts and resolve other relationship issues. And that's when she found that AI can be excessively agreeable when presented with fact-based questions, but there was little knowledge of how these large language models judge social dilemmas. And her team started by measuring this pervasive, what she calls a psychophancy, among all the AIs. They evaluated 11 large language models, including ChatGPT, Cloud, Gemini, and DeepSeek, and they all had this. This is scary, isn't it? Happening right now. Because AI doesn't have a soul. AI doesn't have morality. Because who has that is only God, and it is communicated through real human beings. And with all restrictions and barriers removed from these language models, they are very enticing, and they can have significant influence in our lives. Gone are those days when people would go to televangelists or these prosperity gospel preachers who would do the same thing for them. But the bottom line is this: we can't fault the AI. It is we who go to it. And that's because we like to drift toward voices that affirm us, comfort us, and never confront us. And what was the cost? God was focused on his people whom he specially chose, and he wanted to love and wanted to help them to love others. He was drafting the 10 Commandments and literally writing it with his finger on tablets of stone. But they walked away. And what happens is they now give gold from their own families. They ask their wives and children to remove the gold jewelry. And you know where they got this gold from? This was the gold they got from their Egyptian masters when they were fleeing Egypt. The gold was the wealth from their deliverance. And think about the irony. God freed them from slavery in Egypt. Now they use Egypt's gold to go back into slavery. Because of this desire that has completely messed them up and moved them in this direction. All of us have the same pattern, isn't it? 1 John 2:15 says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world." And James 1, verses 14 and 15 reminds us, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." That's what we see is graphically being portrayed in the life of the Israelites. The greatest battle for you and me or any Christian believer to win is not the battle that is won outside of us. You may think that your sickness is your biggest battle. You may think that your suffering is your biggest battle. You may think that the evil that's happening around you or outside or in this world is your biggest battle. The biggest battle you and I face is not any of these. The biggest battle is the sinfulness of our own hearts, the deep desires of our own hearts. Samson was a man who was gifted with extraordinary strength, but he gave in to his desire for pleasure, which became his idol, which made him forget his calling and giftedness and threw it all away. David was a king. He had a mighty empire. He could defeat Goliath as a small shepherd boy against a giant. He could destroy his enemies in strategic battle plans and expand the kingdom, but he gave in to this unhealthy desire one time in his life for instant gratification. The reason we cannot take delay is because we want what we want when we want, and that when is now. We try to make that into a timetable. But this sin in our hearts is the biggest battle that we can never win by our own efforts. This past week I came to know that one of our pastor friends in Silicon Valley had passed away. He had passed away during COVID, or right after COVID. I just came to find out this week. My wife and I, we knew him, and I hadn't shared this yet with her. And he was pastoring a church in the Evergreen District. And then I went and watched his funeral service. And he had protracted a form of stomach cancer, healthy person. And from the time they diagnosed to his death was 6 months. So his daughter, who was sharing her eulogy as I was watching this, was telling that they gave him a small journal notebook where they would give him one question every day so he can think about it and write. And she shared how towards the end of his life, as his cancer was progressing, the questions had to be shortened and shortened. So she just read one, which was so touching, and I wrote it down. And this is the response that this pastor wrote. As his body was decaying and he was going to die, this is the line that he was able to write. He said, "It is not what happens to me that is important as I face death, but what happens in me. It is not what happens to me that is important right now, but what happens in me." Isn't that amazing? The biggest thing to conquer is not what's around us. You and I can do extraordinary things physically, in our careers, in earning money, or doing incredible feats. I don't have an athletic body, but I've run 3 half Ironman. I can do that. But the biggest thing that bothers me, that I always feel not capable to do, is the smallest, tiniest sinful desires that peek their ugly head every now and then. I cannot fix that by my own strength. So you and I, in that sense, are no different from the nation of Israelites. So what does idolatry do to us? And that's what we look. What do idols do? We read about that in Exodus 32, verses 7 onwards. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and that I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you.'" You know what these idols did? What they do? They breach our covenantal relationship with our loving and holy God. They create a separation. They bring judgment. They never deliver what they promise. God speaks, they have turned aside quickly. Idolatry is covenantal treason. It's not a small mistake. And this is happening to them right after their deliverance, right after God makes a covenant, right after the law is received. They're not just breaking rules, they are rejecting a relationship, and that's what you and I do. But we get a glimpse of who God is in His holiness. It says God sees their hearts. God hears their words. and God knows their actions. We may think that this sinful thought, desire that I have, or act that I am doing is not visible to anyone. God sees it. Whether it's an angry thought or a lustful thought or an act that is not honorable, God sees them all. And He responds in holiness. And God wants to destroy them. And therein is the tension. He says, your people, but Moses intervenes and says, they are your people, God. Justice of God demands destruction, but mercy of God remembers promise. You see, the idols didn't really save them, they only provoked God's wrath. The calf promised fertility, provision, and security, but it brought about judgment. That's the lie of any form of idolatry. The idol promises for us, we make something an idol, whether it's our work or money or children or spouse, because we feel we can get some control, but it only produces anxiety. Your work's not guaranteed. Your relationships are not going to be always the happiest. You are never going to marry the right person, and even if for those who are married, you know how wrong the other person is. The idols are always something that promise comfort, but they leave us empty. Idols promise identity. They think if I have this, I will feel good, but they only result in insecurity. In short, idols promise life, but they produce judgment. We spend our hours and hours in Silicon Valley creating technology that promises control, but it only produces burnouts. And we spend time to build our identity or those of our children through achievement and success, but it only produces exhaustion. Idols don't fail because they are weak. They fail because they were never meant to be God and what God alone can give us. So that brings us to our final question. How does the gospel deliver us from our idols? We read that from verse 11 onwards. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? What Moses does is he begins to intercede for his people. He stands between God and them. And what is Moses appealing to? Moses appeals to God's glory. He appeals to God's reputation. He appeals to God's covenant promises. And God is working through his mediator that he appoints. And God says he relents, not because he made a mistake. He's showing in his grand progressive revelation of redemptive history that you and I always need a mediator. If we were to go and stand before God, and God sees through us in an X-ray vision of the most secret thoughts or words or actions, we will be instantaneously consumed. And God would do what he said he would. But God says, that's why I'm creating a mediator, a buffer between you and me. And that was Moses back then. But still, he relents, but not without diminishing his holiness or his mercy. He immediately destroys the tablet when Moses comes down. That's gone. And then he does something even more serious. He says to them, when he comes down, burning hot, in last verse, he says, he took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. Why would he want them to do? That's a very powerful image. Grinding the gold from the calf they made, from the idol they made, to mix in water and to drink it. He wasn't prescribing them some healthy drink to get some good probiotics or something. It was not a probiotic drink for them. He made them drink it because he wanted them to taste their rebellion. He wanted them to taste their foolishness. He wanted them to taste their failure. And that is exactly what sin does. Eventually, we just don't worship it. We consume this idol without realizing that the idol will consume us. That's what it does. Flint is a small town in Michigan. Some of us may have heard about this story some time ago. It was, I think, in the news during the previous presidential election. Beginning in April of 2015, 99,000 people in Flint, Michigan, the residents were exposed to lead-laced drinking water after a state-appointed emergency manager switched the city's water source to the corrosive Flint River without proper treatment. And this was supposed to be a cost-saving move, but it created a public health emergency. It elevated lead levels in children, causing long-term health, behavioral, and developmental concerns that affect them till today. And the reason was the untreated water caused lead pipes to corrode, allowing lead to leach into the drinking water, literally, which is what the residents were drinking unknowingly. Water with lead. It resulted in them having skin rashes, hair loss, high levels of lead in their blood, and a study indicated up to 25% of children in certain areas experienced elevated blood levels, raising risks for learning disabilities and developmental issues. That's what contaminated lead did do to them. And that's what happens. When people were drinking that water thinking this water will sustain them, but slowly it was poisoning them from the inside. That is what God was asking the Israelites to do. But he didn't stop with Moses. Later on, God sent a better mediator than Moses, who was Christ. God's word written in tablets of stone was thrown and broken to pieces. But Jesus is the word of God. He gets broken on the cross. So we can see his value and his worth and not give into any other idols, so our true love can be restored. We don't get to eat the judgment coming out of our bad actions like the Israelites were asked to, because Jesus' body was torn to pieces and his blood was shed. But we get to eat his body and drink his blood to receive this forgiveness by grace. That should show us the incredible magnitude of this love of God. So either we drink the consequences of our idols or we receive the grace of Christ. And when you do that, it changes everything. The Apostle Paul wrote this in his final letter, a verse that we read almost in every funeral, because his desire was the same desire of every single Christian believer of conquering this evil in our hearts. He said, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race. What an encouraging testimony that is. John MacArthur, who passed away recently, he spent his whole life on expositing the Bible one word at a time. But one of the best lines of his that I remember and I appreciate him for was shared by his son, again in his eulogy after his death, was the last word that he said was, grace has subdued my sin. We don't defeat idols by trying harder. We defeat idols by loving Christ more. So here's the question, my beloved friends. What are you drinking today? What are you trusting to give you life? Because if it's not Christ, it will eventually poison you. But if you come to Him, you won't be consumed. You'll be saved. So let's turn from our idols, trust our mediator, and receive the grace that only Christ can give. And maybe it's a time for us, as we go through this series, to take some time to analyze our own hearts and do an anatomy of our own hearts to see the fingerprints of what is our idol, of where we are looking for identity. We don't just reject idols by effort, we replace them with a greater love and the love of Jesus. You know, the good news is when we turned away, God did not abandon us. He sent a better mediator, not one who would just plead for us, but one who would be pierced for us. Not one who would argue, but one who would absorb God's wrath on your behalf and mine. So that today we don't drink judgment, but we receive grace. My dear friends, as we go through this journey, it's my prayer that me and all of us will discern the idols of our heart and turn from our idols and trust the mediator and receive this grace that only Christ can give.